Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Velez wash processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Thankfully, based out of Auburn, Alabama. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Cheeto Community, a natural processed Ecuadorian coffee. And when purchasing that coffee, I decided to add this one alongside it, as both these coffees caught my interest. They are both Mejorado coffees. The Cheeto Community caught my interest because it is a natural processed Mejorado, and this one caught my interest because it does come from a producer that we've never reviewed on this channel before. And that's going to be the quickest way to get me interested in a coffee, is reviewing a Mejorado from a producer that we've never had before. So we'll see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 49. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a slightly higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 97 degrees Celsius, about 207 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile of this coffee, this one is also listed as one of their extra light offerings. And again, Thankfully isn't necessarily the lightest roasting coffee roaster out there, even with their extra light offerings, which a lot of people can still say is maybe on the slightly more developed side of a very light coffee. But this one is a little bit different, and we're going to include a photo of the coffee beans itself so you can kind of see a little bit of the deviance in the profile of this coffee, because the bean size is very ununiform, and some of them were very small and some of them were a little bit bigger. So you can kind of see that some beans look notably more dark and some of them look notably more light. And as a result, you got a little bit of a mix in the overall way that this coffee did present itself. So this one right here specifically, I think it was just a little bit more difficult to roast. That's actually what I've heard specifically about it. So it's relatively light for the majority of the coffee beans that's on here, but even then the profile did seem to just kind of be a little bit more over the board based off the fact that it wasn't the most uniform coffee to roast. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was mostly expectedly Mejorado-like, as it did have a notable level of sweetness, if maybe not necessarily to the extent that I was expecting, but it's still slightly more subtle for a first impression, as it honestly just felt like this coffee needed time. So I didn't look too deeply into the coffee beans itself. I just kind of took them out and I made the first cup of coffee, and I thought to myself, okay, it's probably just a little bit premature to be brewed, as this coffee did feel very, let's just say, lacking in terms of intensity, a little bit more subtle in general. So I just genuinely attributed that to being the profile being extra light on this one. We move on to day 25 as we opted for the Chemex, and it was a better experience this time around, as it's offering a slightly sweet cracker feel to it with a bit of the listed stone fruit qualities, I should say, just a bit. It cools off primarily in a citric sense with a lingering, lighter floral components to it as well. So it's been very subtle, but a lot of the way that it's presented itself has been pretty noticeable as well. So it mostly mixed experience from these first two tries. Day 28 through the April brewer, and it was the best it had been to this moment, as it feels like the coffee is opening up ever so slightly. There's more of that sweeter cracker feel, which does indicate that this coffee generally, for the most part, is on the lighter side of things. The vast majority of the coffee itself is on the lighter side of things. We'll get into that a little bit more throughout this one, but it does translate a little less into the cup itself, as there's a little bit more of that intensity, just a slight bit more of the Mejorado brown candy characteristics, which did lead me to the idea that maybe a flat bottom brewer, maybe some slightly lower extraction adjustments might help with this coffee, but we'll kind of see, as on day 31, we opted for the V60 with Thankfully's recipe, so a 15.7:1 and 95 degrees Celsius. So this right here was a lower extraction recipe, and we made an important adjustment this time around, as we started pulling out a lot of the Quakers and small beans that were notably darker in color before brewing. And it's a little unfortunate with this coffee. I mentioned a lot that there was a lot of ununiformity to this one, so I really had to go through a lot of the coffee beans to kind of separate them, because not only were there a lot of these really small beans that were dark in color, but there were also a fair few bit of Quakers. So I want to say it was a pretty significant percentage of the bag in general. So as a result, it was kind of tricky to sort through and find beans that were, I want to say, more usable, given that I did have to take out a handful at a time and just kind of sort through them. It did help ever so slightly, but I felt like it just had a little bit more of a clearer sense. Even then, still presenting much more of that sweeter cracker feel, a very softer peach, but I want to say that the profile just seemed to clean up ever so slightly as a result. Day 34 through the Chemex with a hybrid recipe, so went slightly higher on the extraction, did the same thing, sorted through the beans, pulled out the smaller and darker ones as well as the Quakers, and it's the best it had been to this moment, as there's a little bit less of the undesirable qualities, as the coffee is allowing for better definition and sweetness to it, especially in terms of the peachiness as well. So I've just generally seen a little bit of improvement. It did come with having to sort this coffee every single time that we brewed it, but even then I didn't feel like this coffee was anywhere near its potential, but I'm not entirely sure how high the potential was with this coffee as we move on to day 37. Opting for the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, so I did feel like, why don't we try pushing it ever so slightly? This coffee does feel a little bit lighter based off the way that it's presenting itself, being so subtle. And it feels like we have found a little bit of a sweet spot for this coffee, as it does have slightly better intensity and definition this time around, not necessarily to the desired level of sweetness for a Mejorado, but just a little bit more of a citric forward feel, traces of the stone fruit and florality, and notably less of the cracker quality. So it was one of two things. It was either our adjustments or just giving this coffee a little bit more time to open up. Then day 40 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was offering a little bit more of that generic undefined feel from some of the earlier days, as it's unknown whether this coffee would benefit from either being pushed or a little bit more time in general, as it's likely that this is just generally a more tame experience for this coffee overall. And I did have a discussion with somebody that also had a discussion with, thankfully, and it just kind of sounds like this is what this coffee was supposed to be in general. Not supposed to be from the onset, but what this coffee turned out to be by the time that it was released. A little bit more subdued for a Mejorado with a much more subtle and toned down feel, where it didn't really matter if I gave this coffee more time, it didn't matter if I pushed it harder, it didn't matter if I went a little bit lower on the extraction. This is just kind of the way that this coffee was going to turn out regardless. Day 43, back to the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments and a little bit more fine of a grind, and it did seem to help this one ever so slightly, but even then it seems to peak mostly with a lemon head forward experience. Outside of that, some traces of peach, some slight honeysuckle florality, a little bit of that Mejorado sugariness, but in general, it's been a much more tame, softer, and toned down experience. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s, so let's go through those. Cleanliness, level 4. There's certainly nothing at all to take away from the overall cleanliness of this coffee. If anything, you could say that maybe it's a little bit lacking in terms of definition, given that it's such a soft profile to it. But even then, that's being a little bit more critical or harsh than it needs to be. Level 4 cleanliness, it's still a pretty clean coffee in general. Finish, level 4. I feel like that at times felt like it could be a slight bit of a stretch, but there's enough of a lingering, lasting citric quality to this one that can justify it being a little bit higher at that level 4 mark, but it was bordering somewhere between that level 3, and that's mostly because it didn't always have the most amount of intensity to begin with. So level 4, lower side of level 4, where we opted to put that one. Citrus fruit, level 4. I do have to say that of the qualities that were presented within this one, citrus did seem to be the most consistent and abundant, even if it was still presented in a slightly more soft sense. I want to say lemon heads was probably the best descriptor I had for this coffee, especially towards the end, as it just seemed to skew a little bit more in the citric sense than the stone fruit sense, which will take us to the level 3s. We will start with the stone fruit, level 3. I was really hoping for a very sugary, very prominent, very intense peach quality to this one, but it never really seemed to present itself in the manner that I was really hoping for. So a little bit more toned down, there's traces of it, they're more subtle. Level 3 where we opted to put it. Sweetness, level 3. That's going to be a really difficult pill to swallow given that this is a Mejorado coffee. But again, I kind of think that this is the way that this coffee peaked. I was thinking on the earlier days, okay, I see the traces of it, I see the potential there, but even with the adjustments, even with the time, it never really seemed to improve or accentuate too much from that point going forward. Level 3 where we opted to put that. Acidity, level 3, not necessarily the brightest coffee though. Mejorados in general can usually fluctuate somewhere between that 3 and the 4. This one right here on the lower side of things, is it didn't really have a lot of brightness to kind of contribute to the rest of this one, which was just presented much more soft to begin with. Florality, level 3, same thing, traces of that honeysuckle in the same way there are traces of peaches, so not an overly abundant quality within this coffee. And then I guess one more thing worth discussing, final thing worth discussing, body there at the level 3 mark had a little bit more body and texture to it in general, but I think that's just kind of the additional bit of depth that it did have, as there wasn't too much to take away from this one. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, it's very different from what I usually get from a Mejorado coffee, but I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've said a lot throughout this review, and I think a lot of that goes back to some of the conversations that I did have, whether it be with Thankfully directly or some other people that were also working on this coffee as well. As some people seem to also be struggling with this coffee for a while, and I thought that maybe sorting it would really help improve it, but I think there was a relatively low ceiling for this coffee to begin with, and I don't want to fault anybody for this because it does seem like Thankfully's hands were kind of tied with how good they could do with this coffee. I feel like the green in general did have a relatively low ceiling because I don't think that there's much more that could have really been done based off of the lack of uniformity that were presented within the coffee beans themselves. And I'm not sure what happened on the other end. I really don't know the entire backstory of this coffee. All I can tell is from my perspective that it was just a little bit more subtle and tame than I was expecting or hoping for when it comes to a Mejorado coffee. For all I know, maybe the standard profile could have been a little bit better, maybe a little bit more intense, but all I can really do is discuss the coffee that we did work with, and that's just kind of the experience that we did have from this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. A little tricky. I would say somebody that does prefer a much more subtle feel, a little bit more delicacy to their coffee in general. Not necessarily too much intensity in one specific direction, but still presenting a much more clean sense to it with a little bit more of a citric forward feel as well. It has some body. Once again, kind of one of the more notable things when it comes to the depth that this coffee did present. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Velez wash processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. Thank you for watching.